Recently, I audiobooked a book titled How to Have Impossible Conversations, subtitle, A Very Practical Guide. The authors of the book are Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. And in this video, I want to talk about that book. I want to criticize the book. I want to share the reasons why I think it falls short. But before I do that, I want to make sure, I summarize the book and give a fair representation of the book's contents. First of all, this topic, how to have impossible conversations, is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Personally, I pride myself in having a lot of, quote, impossible conversations, in having conversations with all sorts of different people who believe all sorts of outlandish, incorrect things. And often, the conversations that I have, I think, are really useful and really productive. So naturally, I was curious to see what Peter Boghossian has to say. Peter Boghossian is a bit of a respected figure in this area. He's credited with defining the methodology which is known as street epistemology. Anthony Magnabosco is a fairly prominent practitioner of street epistemology, and I've interviewed Anthony Magnabosco on this channel not long ago. And Anthony Magnabosco features in the book How to Have Impossible Conversations. Anthony Magnabosco and his YouTube channel are quoted directly in this book. Before I get into the substance of the book, I want to talk a bit about the tone of the book. And the tone of the book, I would say, is nothing short of messianic. There's a deep sense that the contents of this book are some sort of powerful hidden knowledge that can really change the world. And so here's an example from the book's introduction. Quote, "We believe we're entering an era of renewed interest in effective across-the-aisle dialogue. People are sick of not being able to speak out about controversial subjects and of having to constantly walk on eggshells when voicing their opinions. This book is for those who have had enough name-calling, enough censoring, enough animosity. It provides a comprehensive toolset that enables you to take charge of your conversations. You'll learn how to intervene in someone's thinking and help them change their own mind, and how to mutually search for the truth, even with hardliners and ideologues." End quote. And another example of this kind of, real sense of grandeur, of the importance of this work. There's all these endorsements the book has. One of them is from Glenn Beck, for example. Quote, "In a free republic, there would be no impossible conversations, which begs the question, are we truly free anymore? After reading, listening, and conversing with Peter and James, I am convinced they are the Galileos, Immanuel Kant, and even William Tinsdale of our time." End quote. And so that's the dream. The goal here is that we can build the tools to have these impossible conversations and heal our divided nation, build bridges across ideological and political divides. And that's really a wonderful vision. I mean, who wouldn't want that? I think, indeed, the authors are correct, that these are important skills to be able to have. Of course, it begs the question, to what extent are the authors successful in implementing that vision? So that's the question of this video. That's our topic here today. So what does the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, say about erroneous beliefs? How do we have conversations about erroneous beliefs? And so the key idea, the central idea of the book is known as the unread library effect. And the unread library effect says that most people don't really know why they believe what they believe. And so the analogy, the central example they give is as follows. They say, if you stop someone in the middle of the street, and you say, "Excuse me, sir, do you know how a toilet works?" Most people will say, "Yes, I know how a toilet works." And then if you say, "Can you please draw for me or explain to me specifically how a toilet works?" they will realize they actually don't know how a toilet works. And so this is called the unread library effect. And the idea is most people are overconfident in what they know and what they can justify. And so how does this play out in practice? So in the context of street epistemology, in the context of interrogating a person's belief, you might say to someone, "Okay, what do you believe?" And they might say, "Well, I believe that ghosts are real." And then you might say, "On a scale from 0 to 100, how confident are you that ghosts are real?" And that person might say, "I'm 100% confident that ghosts are real." And then you'll say, "Okay, wow, that's very confident. Are you able to justify that level of confidence?" And of course they'll say, "Yes, I can justify that level of confidence." And so you'll say, "So tell me, when did you first come to this conclusion that ghosts must be real?" And then they will say, "I had an experience where one time something happened and that convinced me that ghosts are real." And then you say, "Okay, let's talk about that. Does that experience that you had really does that really justify 100% confidence in the existence of ghosts? Are there any other possible explanations? Are there any other ways you could have interpreted that same data?" And what will often happen is that people will find that the evidence they have does not warrant the conclusion that they have or the level of confidence they associate with that conclusion. And this can be a very healthy, productive exercise for many people. And you can often realize that what you believe is not as sure. It's not on as sure footing as you might have previously thought. And this can undermine the confidence that people have in various beliefs, hopefully in the direction of more justifiable beliefs. Great. So that's the main methodology of the book. That's the main methodology of street epistemology. And this is very useful for dealing with erroneous beliefs and conspiratorial beliefs. But what about political beliefs? And so political beliefs are treated differently in this book, naturally, as you'd expect, because, if you're debating an issue like, gun control or abortion, naturally, it's hard to see exactly how to apply those tools of street epistemology in practice. And so the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, takes us to this regime of moral epistemology. It says when all else fails, when you're no longer talking about, evidence, justifying conclusions, and how confident you are in a certain proposition being true or false, he says now we are in the world of moral epistemology. What does it take to be a good person? And our book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, points us in the direction of a different book, namely The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Subtitle, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And so, quoting from How to Have Impossible Conversations, quote, Haidt describes moral foundations as being equivalent to the different components of our sense of taste, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, savory, indicating that they're felt as closely and quickly as physical sensations, but applicable to our social universe. Think of them as sensitivity to our underlying values. Conservatives tend to respond to all 6 moral foundations with a particular propensity towards loyalty, authority, and sanctity, and less of a leaning towards care. Liberals are more concerned with care and fairness, and then liberty, with the other 3 foundations almost absent or presenting in remarkably different ways. Nearly all political conversations are rooted in foundational values. This creates tremendous difficulty when your foundational values do not match those of your conversation partner. End quote. And so the 6 foundational values that Jonathan Haidt outlines in his book, The Righteous Mind, the 6 moral foundations, the 6 senses, you might say, of morality that this book adopts are care versus harm being 1, fairness versus cheating being 2, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation, liberty versus oppression. And so again, we have this nice, beautiful mathematics, these ingredients that you can mix up. You mix some ingredients, you get a conservative, you mix some other ingredients, you get a liberal, you mix some other ingredients, you get independent. And Jonathan Haidt will say, and he's written this in his book, and he said this in his TED Talks, for example, we need both. We need liberals and conservatives. It's like a yin and a yang, a push and pull of the different values. And really, we need all of them together, working together. And of course, what he's echoing here, what he's reflecting is a kind of like enlightened centrism. This idea that smart people like Jonathan Haidt and the readers of The Righteous Mind, they're sort of outside of politics. They're a little bit above politics. They look down from their perch and they see the right and the left fighting it out, but they know and they hope and they pray that it's the middle that will win, because the middle is where it's really at. The middle is when there's no political change, when you don't do anything in the direction of conservatism, you don't cut taxes or raise taxes really, because it's the middle road between the poles where the enlightened centrist lives and, feels very good about himself as the political battle wages around him. You can hear echoes of the same kind of enlightened centrism in How to Have Impossible Conversations. In a section of the book titled Extremists Go Too Far, our authors tell us, quote, if your partner is on the other side of a political divide, she will not trust the extremists on your side, making an easy point of agreement if you express the same sentiment. Because of our polarized media environment, she also likely knows more about your extremists than about moderate expressions of beliefs on your side. The same is true about knowing good arguments for your positions. In other words, your partner across the divide is likely to unfairly attach beliefs about extremists on your side to you. Extremism fosters tribalism, polarization, unwarranted skepticism, distrust, defensiveness, and frustratingly unfair caricatures of the other side's views. Worse, extremism on one side drives people to reciprocate with extremism on an opposing side. Think of neo-Nazis and Antifa. You can turn this disadvantage to your advantage, however, by explicitly disavowing your side's extremists. End quote. And so again, the sentiment that, both sides go too far. And the fascists are just as bad as the anti-fascists. And the racists and the racist cops who, kill a black person in the street are just as bad as the Black Lives Matter protesters who protest such violence. this idea that, both sides are going too far, is really sort of the central moral core of the book. I think these two books, How to Have Impossible Conversations and The Righteous Mind, are two great examples, two really typical examples of this kind of smart person book. Someone whose intelligence is like a very important part of their identity, the kind of person who really pines for like Plato's philosopher kings, who wishes we could be ruled by like really brilliant philosopher dictators. The sense that, so much of what's wrong with the world is because people aren't smart or they don't think clearly enough, and we need to rectify the way people think to fix the world. So what do I think about this book? Well, I have a lot of criticisms and I want to go through them. The first thing I want to think about and point out is this deep sense in the book. You can talk with anyone. There's no one you can not talk to. There's no conversation that's off limits. Here's an example of the way this sentiment is expressed in How to Have Impossible Conversations. Quote, "You may be saying to yourself, I can talk to a lot of people like a partner, but I couldn't do that with a racist. Yes, you can. If the black musician Daryl Davis can have civil conversations with Klansmen and help them abandon the KKK, and he has a closet full of relinquished hoods to prove it, then you can talk to a racist or to anyone holding any belief system and discover why they believe what they believe." End quote. So the first thing that really jumps out at me is this name drop of Daryl Davis. And we're going to come back to this, and we're going to talk about what Daryl Davis does and doesn't do. But it's in my opinion, like a really obnoxious name drop. Like if you want an analogy, it's like, imagine you're reading a book about business, which has some like very specific, unique ideas about like how businesses work, and how to run a business. And then they say, you might be thinking to yourself, can I really start a business? Well, look at Elon Musk. If Elon Musk can start a business, then surely you can also be successful in business. Like the idea that the fact you can point to one successful example, and the implicit assumption that the content of this book has anything to do with the character that you're pointing to, when in reality there's like no connection at all, is a little bit, I would say shocking, because again, we're going to come back to this, but there's no connection between what Daryl Davis does and what this book is suggesting. But the other thing which really stands out to me, and I think it's just so important, when you read this book, there's a certain energy that comes across, and I don't really know how to express this, and I hesitate to use this terminology, this language, because I know I risk offending some people, but I'm not really sure of a better way to express it. And so with apologies to anyone who might be offended, there's this deep sense of like real white person energy that comes across in this paragraph and throughout the book. Someone like Peter Boghossian, a white male who has never been like called a slur to his face, doesn't live in a society where he's vulnerable, and a large percentage of the population debates like whether or not he should have basic rights in society. He doesn't have like a history that has been erased by people who just harbor totally negative views towards him and people of his identity. It's so easy to say, yeah, you can talk to anyone. There's no conversation you can't have, okay? Obviously, if you're black, or if you're Jewish, or if you're a woman, or if you're gay, or some part of some other group, it is incredibly difficult and possibly demeaning and debasing to have a conversation with someone who feels just nothing but animosity towards you. And there are all sorts of ways of expressing that. If I'm in a conversation with a conspiracy theorist, they might call me a slur or some unpleasant name about my Jewishness. But more subtly, they could just say, listen, the Holocaust didn't exist, okay? Get with the program. Which is like a more subtle way of just insulting and demeaning and offending me. Similarly, how do you expect a black person to have a conversation with someone who thinks that blacks are low IQ, and do that in a way with self-respect? Like this, let's just have this conversation rationally. Let's talk about epistemology. Let's talk about evidence. This sort of like privileged assumption of, really these conversations are so easy to have, and no conversation is impossible, really betrays, I think, sort of a myopic view of the authors. Imagine you're a woman and you're, trying to have a debate with a misogynist, and the misogynist is saying things like, women belong in the kitchen. Women shouldn't have had the right to vote. The idea that you should just, keep your cool and not get upset and just have very rational conversation with this person about what his evidence is and things like that is just demeaning and ridiculous. But it's so convenient for someone like Peter Boghossian, who's never had that experience and never risks ever having that experience, to say, yeah, you can have any conversation you want with anyone. Don't worry about it. So let's move on to another criticism, and that is the book totally misunderstands politics. Within the world of this book and the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and within the universe of smart person books in general, politics is a kind of applied philosophy. Okay, like you go to school, you get a doctorate in philosophy, you can now think very well. Maybe you also have science background and you understand things about the world and maybe some social science, and now you apply it to making good laws. If politics is like applied philosophy, then the dialogues we have around politics, you'd expect to be dialogues that sound very philosophical and sound, what is your epistemology here? What is your evidence? How does your moral epistemology work? What are the moral foundations that you're using to arrive at your view of the world? I don't doubt that this lens has some merit. I don't doubt that there are cases when a lens that focuses on epistemology and moral epistemology and perhaps science and things like that can be useful. No doubt, no doubt. But let's talk to a first approximation, okay? A first approximation means in general, in most cases, okay, before we get to sort of unusual, exotic cases, when we're talking about the standard case of what is politics, what does it mean to have a political debate? What does it mean for two people to disagree on what should happen politically? I will give you an example of what that looks like, okay? To a first approximation, politics is like this. Politics is like a municipality, a government wants to build a road through a town, and the road can go in one of two places, and there will be winners and losers. There will be trade-offs depending on where the road is built. Property values will go up and down. Views that were previously very scenic are going to be destroyed. Construction projects are going to create noise pollution, and traffic is going to route drivers from one part of town to another part of town. There are just tangible, financial, economic, quality of life consequences to this decision, okay? And how do we decide who wins, who loses? How do we decide who gets messed over and who benefits? You vote. It's very simple. You just vote. There's no philosophy here. There's no epistemology here. There's no moral foundations here. It's very simple. It's a question of who is going to get what they want and who's going to suffer. Who's going to benefit and who's going to pay. Okay? When you think of taxes in society, in our society, in every society, there's a tension between people who want more social services that benefit the poor, which means more healthcare, more access to inexpensive healthcare, more access to public transportation and food stamps and all sorts of government programs that benefit the poor. And there's people who want lower taxes and a cutting of those same services. Okay? There's a tension between rich people who want more money in their paycheck and poor people who want more government services that benefit them. And this has nothing to do. This has nothing to do with any philosophy. This has nothing to do with any moral epistemology nonsense. This has nothing to do with evidence. It has to do with self-interest, okay? To a first approximation, politics is about self-interest. Politics is about war by another means. Politics is about just making sure your side, your coalition, your in-group is ascendant in society, gets the benefits of society, reaps the benefits of the tax revenue the government collects, and the other group gets less, gets messed over. They get kicked out and pushed down, and they get hurt and they get harmed. That's how politics works to a first approximation. And so much of the discussion about moral foundation theory and moral frameworks and epistemology in the context of politics is just pure nonsense. Okay, I'll go as far as to say when I read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt years ago, it just struck me as total nonsense. Imagine applying Jonathan Haidt's ideas to the Civil War, okay? This idea that, listen, we have slave owners and we have people who are against slavery. And they have different moral foundations. And in reality, we need both, We need nothing to happen because we need this political, moral tension in our society. And everyone is sort of right in their own way. Or apply that to segregation, okay? Apply that to the Holocaust, where the question is, do we want democracy or not want democracy? It's just moral senses. It's like different taste buds. Some people like ice cream, chocolate, some people like vanilla. People just like different things. Who cares, Everyone's right. It's nonsense, obviously. It's ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. Historically, in practice, we make moral progress. We move from a politics which is more self-centered and more insular and more benefiting a small group to a wider coalition politics that benefits more and increasingly more people. And of course, today, our own politics are motivated by those exact same tensions. People who want democracy to serve them and their smaller coalition, and people who want democracy to serve a larger circumference of people and benefit society in a more inclusive way. Another thing this book totally misses, and I just think so many smart people just miss this, is the way in which politics, since it's about self-interest, and ultimately politics is about being ascendant in society and having more money and more benefits accrued to you in your society, there is such a strong, powerful motivation to lie when you come to these political discussions. There's such a strong, powerful motivation to surrender to motivated reasoning, okay? If you are a oil and gas company, or you have sympathies with oil and gas companies, or you are paid by oil and gas companies, okay? You are so biased when it comes to questions around climate change, obviously. And that's the default. That's the default. We come to political conversations with extreme bias and extreme slant, and everyone does. The idea that people are coming to these conversations about immigration or gun control or abortion or whatever the case may be with open minds and as honest actors in good faith is so unrealistic. And it's a huge problem for a book that believes, we're on the verge of a messianic era where everyone's going to have these impossible conversations and come to truth, by understanding moral foundation theory. One of the things that's really tricky about these questions of epistemology and interrogating people's beliefs is that there are no clear-cut boundaries dividing honest opinion, for example, on the one hand, compared to motivated reasoning or compared to outright lies. These things sort of bleed into each other. So take the abortion case, for example. The smart person understanding of abortion is that there's two opinions, there's multiple opinions about when life starts. Does life start at conception, or does life start at viability, or later in a pregnancy? And the smart person understanding of abortion is that because of these differences of opinion, because of these different moral outlooks, because of these different definitions of life, you arrive at different conclusions about abortion. The problem with that is no one really believes life starts at conception. People say they believe life starts at conception. People might think they believe life starts at conception, but no one has any problem with in vitro fertilization, which is a perfectly mainstream, widespread way of helping women who are having fertility problems to have children. And it's a wonderful thing. And so many people from all walks of life, from all religious backgrounds, take advantage of in vitro fertilization. Of course, in the process of in vitro fertilization, fertilized eggs get thrown out, obviously. And no one thinks this is a problem. No one thinks this is murder. No one thinks that because you have a fertilized egg and there's a potential life there, therefore you can't throw out this egg. No one thinks that. Literally no one. And there's no reason you should, because the border between a sperm and an egg and a fertilized sperm and an egg is a totally arbitrary border. There's no consciousness there. If your criteria is like potential for life, well, a sperm is as much a potential for life and an egg is as much a potential for life as a fertilized egg. Similarly, it goes without saying that in a burning building situation where you can rescue one child, or you can rescue 1,000 fertilized eggs from a laboratory, no one thinks that it's morally advantageous to try to rescue the fertilized eggs over the living child. So no one really believes life starts at conception. Yet a lot of people will say life starts at conception. This came up specifically recently on the Lex Fridman podcast. So Lex Fridman is a classic smart person podcaster, and he talks with all sorts of different people. And so he talked with Kanye West recently, and he was pressing Kanye West about Kanye West's anti-Semitism. And so he said, Kanye West, I think you don't care very much about the Jewish Holocaust. And Kanye West said, well, do you know what, Lex Fridman, you don't care about the Holocaust of black babies that are getting aborted. Okay. And then after talking to Kanye West about anti-Semitism, Lex Fridman had Ben Shapiro on the podcast. So Ben Shapiro is this Orthodox Jew who is a conservative, and so he asked Ben Shapiro and says, Kanye said a lot of offensive things. What do you think about his statement comparing abortion to the Holocaust? And Ben Shapiro said, that actually doesn't offend me, because I agree that aborting babies is a moral abomination on par with the Holocaust. Okay, so a few things here. First of all, In the Orthodox Jewish world, there's no question that abortion is permitted in many cases. That's not debatable. In the Orthodox Jewish world that I inhabit and Ben Shapiro inhabit, it's a fact that abortion is permitted, and Ben Shapiro, when he says otherwise, is just lying. That's clear and obvious to anyone in the Orthodox Jewish world. Just one example of many examples that can be brought to bear to prove this point is the fact that in Israel, a country where public transportation doesn't run on Saturdays because of the Sabbath, abortion is allowed. And the reason abortion is allowed is not because it's a secular state that has a very strict separation between church and state. It's because when the country was founded and these questions were being adjudicated, they asked the ultra-Orthodox rabbis at the time in Israel and says, should abortion be allowed in our country? And they said, yes, in many cases it's allowed and permissible according to Jewish law. So there's no question that Ben Shapiro is just lying on this topic. But why? Why do people like Ben Shapiro lie on this issue of abortion? Why do so many people have such a strong stance that abortion is murder and life begins at conception? Well, a big part of it is because for many people who are of means, upper middle class, someone like Ben Shapiro, they know that their right to abortion will never be threatened. As long as you have money, as long as you can fly, as long as you live in the modern world, you will always be able to get to a place where you can have an abortion. But for people who are poor and people who are not of means and cannot travel readily, for young people in poor communities that might get pregnant accidentally, their life will be ruined. Their life will be ruined. And people like Ben Shapiro know that. And people who have the strongest stances on abortion know that. And that's ultimately the point. It's because it doesn't hurt me to put barriers in front of getting an abortion, but it hurts poor people. And moreover, the deeper point I think is even more important than this, the more crucial point, is that Ben Shapiro explicitly draws an analogy. He explicitly embraces the comparison between abortion in America today and the Holocaust. And the reason he does that, the reason that is the refrain you hear from Kanye and from other people on the right, is because the claim is that the moral landscape in America today is on par with that of the Holocaust. That we're living through such a moral catastrophe, and that our response needs to be the same level of intensity and the same level of readiness for violence as you would expect to see during World War II Germany. The claim being made by Ben Shapiro and others is that American democracy is a failed project. Because if American democracy votes and the people decide that murder is now okay, you don't start, we shouldn't be allowing murder, we should be dissolving American democracy. American democracy becomes the enemy, and that ultimately is what this is all about. And so trying to tease apart, what's an honest opinion about abortion versus what's a motivated reasoning versus what's a straight out lie is not possible, because largely as actors, as agents in this world who hold beliefs, our own threads are completely tangled. Our own ideas about what we truly believe and why we believe is confused and muddled. Subjectively, we don't have the tools to differentiate between what are the honest beliefs we hold for good reason versus what are the beliefs we hold because we've been lied to or propagandized or we've lied to ourselves. All this nuance, all this complexity is completely lost in a book that assumes everyone is a good actor and everyone is coming to the table as either a philosopher or a potential philosopher who can have a very reasoned discussion with you about moral epistemology. And the last thing I'll say about the book is that the way politics works is clear to people who are students of history, who are students of political struggle, students of the civil rights movement, and students of women's suffrage and the history of feminism. Understand that rights are won through battles, are won through marches and through protests. And in the case of the labor struggle in America and the civil rights struggle, they're often bloody and violent struggles that happen in the streets. And that's how rights are won. They're wrested from the forces that be, from power. But for someone like Peter Boghossian, who comes at this subject with this real, like I said before, kind of white person energy, white male energy, who's never been a part of any struggle, who has no intuition about the kind of vicious ulterior motives, the kind of hateful rhetoric and the kind of hateful stereotypes and biases and bigotry that people come to the table with when dealing with these thorny political issues. To him, we're all just one deep philosophical conversation away from bridging the divide, from intervening in each other's ideas about politics. In the context of a book like How to Have Impossible Conversations, there's a deep sense that everyone thinks alone, that everyone comes to their own conclusions. Justified beliefs are beliefs that we have evidence for and beliefs that we can support in dialogue and clearly and effectively explain why we have the confidence in the belief that we have. I'm here to tell you this is nonsense. This is the high road to conspiracy theory. When I talk to flat earthers and I say, Mr. Flat Earther, how do you know the earth is flat? They say things like, listen, I did an experiment in my backyard. Okay, I took a pan and I shined moonlight on the pan and I saw that the moonlight was cold. Okay, and this shook my whole worldview. Conspiracy theories are people who have run the experiment themselves, who have, built up a conspiracy from the ground up from their own work, their own reasoning, and their own scientific experiments. Healthy people, in my opinion, people who have a correct worldview, understand that we don't think alone, that we rely on a network of experts, we rely on a framework, on a society and a culture that operates by surfacing good information, surfacing that information so that our economy can work, so that democracy can work. And it's perfectly legitimate and perfectly healthy to understand that and to rely on experts. When I was talking to Anthony Magnabasco, I asked him, what is your confidence that the earth is round? And the reason I asked this question is because this is the question that Anthony asks all his interlocutors. What is your confidence that ghosts exist? What is your confidence that God exists? And the answer he gave me at first was 95%. And I was shocked at this answer. I said, how could it be so low? How could it be that you're only 95% confident the earth is round? To me, that's a staggeringly low number. And it's obvious to me that the problem for Anthony in that situation is that he's programmed, he's trained to think that confidence can only come from our level of justification. And Anthony understands correctly that it's very hard for a regular person like me, him, you, anyone else to prove that the earth is round. We don't have direct evidence of that. We've never seen the curvature of the earth unless you've gone to space. When you're in an airplane, you don't see the curvature of the earth. The earth feels flat. It legitimately does. So it's very hard to give a high number of confidence, yet we are extremely confident. And the reason I think it's justified to be extremely confident is because none of modern society would make sense if the earth was flat and everything and everyone was deluded about that fact. Modern capitalism, modern technology, modern democracy, none of that would be possible. None of that would make any sense. And so beliefs don't exist in isolation. Beliefs don't exist as like the pinnacle of some edifice of evidence that produces like a kind of neat little staircase that you can walk up to and get to the top. Beliefs interact in a much more complex and chaotic way, and they form these structures, and these structures can become very stable and very hard to alter or to change. So where does this leave us? Of course, I want to end on a positive note, on a constructive note. As someone who invests a lot of time and thought and energy into these kinds of conversations, these quote impossible conversations, I do think that it's an important goal to try to have conversations and try to intervene in people's thinking on these issues. So what are the tools? What are the techniques? How do we change people's minds? In her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Arlie Russell Hochschild describes what she calls a deep story. And in her book, she's exploring what is it that made so many people so enthralled, so enamored with Trump in the year 2016, specifically from Middle America. And she says, what do they see in Trump? What do they see in America that has sort of brought about this really vibrant, powerful Tea Party political movement in America? And she says, to understand these people, you need to understand their deep story. So she writes as follows, quote, "A deep story is a feels as if story. It's the story feelings tell in the language of symbols. It removes judgment. It removes fact. It tells us how things feel. Such a story permits those on both sides of the political spectrum to stand back and explore the subjective prism through which the party on the other side sees the world. And I don't believe we understand anyone's politics, right or left, without it. For we all have a deep story. The deep story here, that of the Tea Party, focuses on relationships between social groups within our national borders. I constructed this deep story to represent in metaphorical form the hopes, fears, pride, shame, resentment, and anxiety in the lives of those I talk to." Then I tried it out on my Tea Party friends to see if they thought it fit their experience. They did." End quote. And in her book, she goes on to describe that deep story as a sense of, working hard, waiting in line for the American dream, and feeling like the line is being cut by all sorts of minority groups, by immigrants, by black people who are getting handouts and are sort of cutting the line. And her point is that this isn't true. This isn't reality. This is a deep story. This is what it feels like. And I think what we can do to try to have productive conversations and try to better understand people and respect people across political divides is to try to get to know a person's deep story. What are the anxieties and the fears and the prejudices, perhaps, the perceptions of the world that drive their political views? And when you understand that we come to politics through our deep story, not through our philosophy, not through our epistemology or our rationality, it gives us ideas about how we can properly intervene in a person's political views. To go back to the abortion case, for example, it's very hard to have an extreme, hardline, ideologically pure, anti-abortion stance. If you or someone you know has had a child with anencephaly and has medically needed an abortion, it's very hard to have an extreme anti-abortion stance if you are in touch with, through personal experience or through the experience of a loved one, just the complexities and the difficulties that are attendant to pregnancy, the risks to the mother, the risks to the child, and the sense that the decisions that are made, the most difficult life and death, health, safety decisions that a pregnant woman can make should be between her and her doctor and should not be limited and curtailed by Republican lawmakers or any lawmaker. It's very hard to have a strict anti-abortion stance if you can imagine or if you've experienced what it's like for a young person to accidentally become pregnant and the fallout of that experience and the risks associated with that experience. And if you can imagine either, again, through a story or through reading a book or through personal experience or just having a vivid imagination, what that would be like to have a child, a young person's life derailed for an accident like that. What that would mean for that family, for that kid, for the young child growing up with a single young parent. If you can embody those experiences, if you can imagine those experiences, it becomes very hard to have strict, extreme anti-abortion stances. And so ultimately, in the case of abortion, like all political cases, the road towards intervening in a person's belief, the road towards changing people's minds is to just share stories, to understand stories, to encourage learning about real life experiences. The terminology for this is called deep canvassing. And there's been, studies done and people have collected data on the effectiveness of, people who knock on someone's door and they say, "Look, I'd like to meet you. What's your stance on abortion? I want to share with you a personal story from my life where I needed an abortion for some medically necessary reason." Or in the case of gay marriage, knocking on someone's door and saying, "What's your stance on gay marriage? You're against gay marriage? Okay. I just want to share with you my personal experience, what it was like for me when I was either able or not able to marry my spouse," or something like that. And just sharing a personal story, a relevant anecdote, has a hugely powerful effect on changing people's minds. And that's ultimately, I think, the only effective, meaningful method for trying to intervene in a person's politics. I think back to when I first was woken up to the moral imperative, the moral urgency of the Palestinian struggle. When I first met Palestinians and I heard firsthand their stories, what it was like living under occupation. And it became obvious to me that there was a deep story here. There was an experience here, a human experience that required serious moral consideration. And until I had that experience, until I met those people, until I met Palestinians, I was blind to all that. And no amount of evidence or rationality would have helped that problem of blindness. Earlier in this video, I mentioned Daryl Davis. I mentioned the fact that the authors of How to Have Impossible Conversations sort of compare what they're doing to the work of Daryl Davis. It's very clear to me, who has read about and seen what Daryl Davis does, that what he does has nothing to do with the contents of How to Have Impossible Conversations. What he does is just deep canvassing. What he does is he just gets to know people, and he just shares his life, his experience. He's just himself. He's just himself sharing himself as a friend. And he's such a likable, amazing, charismatic person that it becomes very, very hard to harbor racial animosity, to harbor that kind of hate and resentment if you know someone like Daryl Davis. As we talked about earlier in this video, there is a very complex and intricate relationship between our politics and our beliefs about the world in general. And certainly conspiracy theories are closely linked with politics. Some people's politics can be downstream of conspiracy theories. In America, ideas about building a wall on our southern border, all sorts of ideas about immigrants are closely related to totally nonsense conspiracy theories about immigration, how immigration works in this country. But the causality goes both ways. For people who are antagonistic to American democracy and to the direction they think American democracy is going, it can be very efficacious to promote conspiracy theories that undermine our media, that undermine the scientific community, that undermine democracy and the faith that people have that they can hold their government accountable, that they can be active participants in the democratic process, that undermine our belief that democracy works, that our elections are fair, for example. And so with that connection in mind, we could still ask ourselves, what are the techniques available for conversing, for trying to intervene in a person's beliefs about the world, to trying to talk with someone who is a conspiracy theorist? It's well understood. It's so well understood that it's sort of entered into our vocabulary that the road to conspiracy theories is rabbit holes. And of course, what is a rabbit hole? A rabbit hole is when you come across some idea, some thread, some source that provides some very surprising, innocuous information, some idea that seems totally unthreatening. It just seems like an interesting tidbit, an interesting topic to learn more about. And as you learn more, you go down a rabbit hole and you start encountering more and more erroneous ideas or extreme ideas. And so eventually, when you've gone down enough, you've become so inundated with a certain kind of slant, a certain type of source, a certain particular worldview that you're now deep in a rabbit hole and you believe things that we might say are fringe or conspiratorial. These are ideas that if you just present it to someone out of the blue, out of nowhere, you say, for example, I believe the earth is flat, or I believe the moon landing was faked. These ideas might get laughed at. They're totally outlandish. But if you go down a rabbit hole, meaning you start somewhere very innocuous, you pick up on a thread about how maybe things in the modern world just feel off. Maybe, you have the sense that there's some puppet masters pulling the strings or something. You can slowly inch your way in the direction of these beliefs that over time they seem perfectly reasonable. And I think the key thing to understand about these kind of conspiracy theories is that when we build up a strong network of beliefs, when we've become inundated and saturated with sources and ideas and quote experts that are all promoting a single kind of narrative, even if that's a conspiratorial narrative or an anti-mainstream narrative, we get to a place where certain beliefs are really unimpeachable. Certain beliefs are really totally inaccessible to reasoning and to new evidence. And the reason is understandable. It's because these ideas have become so well enforced, so entrenched, so ingrained that they are part of a person's identity. And so what do you do with that? How do you intervene with someone who has built up this fortress of conspiracy theory, this fortress of anti-establishment thinking? To me, the obvious answer is embedded in the problem itself. The world is filled with rabbit holes, with wonderful, wonderful rabbit holes. For curious minds, and conspiracy theorists are often some of the most curious minds, the world is filled with the most wonderful rabbit holes about history, the most wonderful rabbit holes about geopolitics and societies, and for example, my favorite, just the most wonderful rabbit holes about physics and the laws of nature. Okay, just to give a taste, just to give one specific concrete example of what I'm talking about. And I could think of, 10 examples just like this off the top of my head. Okay? Everyone knows magnets exist. Everyone has played with magnets. The ancients knew about magnets because iron ore, magnetic forms of ore, are naturally occurring on our planet, and ancient peoples knew about them. Electric charges are also totally visible and available for anyone to play with and explore. And it was also known to the ancients that if you rub wool and amber together, you can create electric charges that create an attractive force between the wool and the amber. So this is known. This is known to every child who's played with magnets and to who's created static electricity on their shirt. But what was not known until much more recently, historically speaking, is that the electric force and the magnetic force are linked, and they're linked in the most unintuitive way. A magnetic force has no effect on an electric force unless one of the forces are moving. So a magnet will not have an influence on a surface with an electric charge unless one of those two things are moving at a very high speed. This is actually very convenient for us. Our Earth has a magnetic field, and that magnetic field shields us from incoming electric particles, which are all such forms of potentially dangerous radiation. But the reason we have that shielding effect is because those electric particles are moving so quickly towards Earth. And eventually, the relationship between electric force and the magnetic force were formalized by a man named James Clerk Maxwell, who formulated the Maxwell equations, and he put in very concise mathematical form everything we knew about electric and magnetic fields. How magnets always come in dipoles, meaning a magnet always has a positive and negative pole. And if you cut a magnet in half, you get a new positive and negative pole. And how electric fields came in monopoles. And he also formalized the fact that if you have a moving electric field, it creates a magnetic field. So this is what we call an electromagnet. If you wrap a wire around a piece of metal and you run a current through the wire, that metal becomes magnetized. And similarly, the inverse relation holds, that if you move a magnet within a coil, it creates an electric field within the coil. And so this beautiful, symmetrical understanding of the relationship between electricity and magnetization became apparent for the first time, this beautiful unification. And it wasn't until Albert Einstein formulated his theory of relativity, the sense that moving reference frames experience a contraction of space and they experience time dilation. It wasn't until that we were able to develop an understanding of why a moving electric field creates a magnetic field and vice versa. And walking through that relationship, walking through that unification is one of the most beautiful, exciting things anyone can learn. And it's all available, of course, online through countless YouTube videos that explain this very beautifully. And one of the just like stunning consequences to come out of the Maxwell equations is that if you move an electron, if you vibrate an electron in a certain way, you have a moving electric field. And if it's done right, the moving electric field will generate a magnetic field in parallel, sort of orthogonal to the electric field. And that vibrating magnetic field will create, in turn, an electric field, and on and on and on forever. And you realize that you can have this sort of in parallel or this orthogonal fields vibrating and propagating each other through space at the speed of light. And what emerges from the Maxwell equations so beautifully, so elegantly, is that that's what light is. Light is a propagating electromagnetic field. And when you learn these things, and there's so many other examples in every field of inquiry, when you go down this rabbit hole, you become struck by the effectiveness of science, by the beauty of science. You can learn about how all the GPSs in our phones require adjusting the timings that we get from the satellites when we send satellite signals, because the speed of the satellites moving around the Earth induces a time dilation, and those clocks run slower. You can learn about the history of gyroscopes and learn about the techniques we can use to measure the Earth's rotation. Simple gyroscopes that you can create and play with in your home. You can learn about, you could see experiments on YouTube of Foucault's pendulum, which measures the rotation of the Earth, and all these beautiful, wonderful, amazing experiments, and how technology has evolved so rapidly in modern times. And you just get a deep appreciation for the scientific method and for And the way science explains modernity, the way science explains everything we see in our world today, it explains the cell phones that we carry and the airplanes that we fly in. And it becomes much harder to hold anti-scientific beliefs. It becomes much harder to be a climate change skeptic. It becomes much harder to think that there's some massive cover-up, some massive conspiracy that's lying to you and to everyone else about the safety of vaccines. It becomes much harder to believe that a vaccine that's been administered to more than 5 billion people around the world is somehow dangerous, and no one except for fringe voices outside of the scientific community know about that. And so I think the only way to really deal with conspiracy theories like anti-vaccine conspiracy theories or conspiracy theories about global warming or immigration, or whatever the case may be, is to encourage people in the direction of new rabbit holes. A person who understood this dynamic beautifully, brilliantly well was GK Chesterton. Writing in his book Orthodoxy, quote, "The madman's explanation of a thing is always complete, and often, in a purely rational sense, satisfactory. Or to speak more strictly, the insane explanation, if not conclusive, is at least unanswerable. If a man says, for instance, that men have a conspiracy against him, you cannot dispute it except by saying that all men deny that they are conspirators, which is exactly what conspirators would do. His explanation covers the facts as much as yours. Or if a man says that he is the rightful king of England, it is no complete answer to say that the existing authorities call him mad, for if he were king of England, that might be the wisest thing for the existing authorities to do. Nevertheless, he is wrong. But if we attempt to trace his error in exact terms, we shall not find it quite so easy as we had supposed. Perhaps the nearest we can get to expressing it is to say this, that his mind moves in a perfect but narrow circle. A small circle is quite as infinite as a large circle, but though it is quite as infinite, it is not so large. In the same way, the insane explanation is quite as complete as the sane one, but it is not so large. There is such a thing as a narrow universality. There is such a thing as a small and cramped eternity. The lunatic's theory explains a large number of things, but it does not explain them in a large way. I mean that if you or I were dealing with a mind that was growing morbid, we should be chiefly concerned, not so much to give it arguments as to give it air, to convince it that there was something cleaner and cooler outside the suffocation of a single argument." End quote. I believe our goal and our orientation when coming into these conversations with people, when trying to have impossible conversations, whether those be about politics or about the world or conspiracy theories, we should not be concerned with providing arguments, with providing debate. We should be chiefly concerned with giving air, with giving new stories and new rabbit holes and new avenues of exploration to go down and to learn together and to share.